you're 19. It's 30,000 years ago. You just made a mistake that could kill you. Not violence, not a predator in the tree line. Something far more common. And for most of human history, something far more fatal. Nobody warned you this could happen. Nobody sat you down first. So who exactly was supposed to? That question sounds almost funny at first. Sex is the one thing nobody has to teach you, right? It's instinct. Animals just do it. No manual required. But here's the problem. Humans aren't animals in the way that matters here. We're the only species on Earth that regularly has sex face to face. We're the only one whose females hide ovulation from their own bodies. And childbirth itself only works because of a shape our ancestors' hips evolved over millions of years. A shape that's still, honestly, a bad fit for the size of a human head. None of that is obvious. None of that is automatic. Somebody had to pass that knowledge along, person to person, for 200,000 years, with zero books, zero internet, zero awkward health teacher holding up a diagram. That's the real question hiding under the clickbait one. Not did ancient humans have sex? Obviously they did. You're proof of that. The real question is how they knew what they were doing. And the honest answer is older, stranger, and way more organized than you'd guess. Let's start with why this mattered so much. Because the stakes were brutal. For almost all of human history, getting this wrong didn't mean an awkward conversation the next morning. It meant death. Across most of the ancient and pre-modern world, somewhere between 1 in 100 and 1 in 20 women died from complications related to childbirth. A staggering number by any modern standard. And one that stayed roughly that high until antiseptics and modern obstetrics arrived in the 20th century. Pregnancy, without any spacing between births, could kill through exhaustion, through malnutrition, through the body simply running out of reserves to give. And here's the part that makes it worse. Human childbirth is unusually dangerous compared to other primates. Anthropologists call it the obstetrical dilemma. Human babies have huge heads, and human hips are narrow because we walk upright on 2 legs. That's not a small design flaw. That's a trade-off evolution never fully solved. So this wasn't some low-stakes topic ancient people could shrug off. Getting the mechanics wrong, the timing wrong, the spacing between births wrong, any of that could end a life, which means somebody, somewhere, had to be doing the teaching. The question is who? And the evidence that answers it is a lot older than most people assume. And it's not just about mothers, either. Infant mortality throughout most of prehistory was staggeringly high. By modern standards, a huge percentage of children didn't survive their first few years, regardless of how careful anyone was. That meant every single piece of reproductive knowledge carried enormous weight. Knowing how to space births to protect a mother's health. Knowing which practices seemed connected to healthier pregnancies. Knowing when a birth was going wrong and needed help. None of that was optional trivia. It was survival infrastructure on the same level as knowing which plants were poisonous or which water sources were safe. You'd expect a community to guard infrastructure like that carefully, to teach it deliberately, correct it when it went wrong, and refuse to leave it purely to chance. And that's exactly the pattern the evidence shows. Let's talk about the oldest hard evidence first. In 2008, in a cave called Hohle Fels in southwestern Germany, a team led by archaeologist Nicholas Conard uncovered a small mammoth ivory carving. It's roughly 40,000 years old. It's known today as the Venus of Hohle Fels, and it is, bluntly, an exaggerated depiction of a female body. Enlarged breasts, wide hips, a carved vulva rendered in unmistakable, deliberate detail. This wasn't erosion. It wasn't accidental. It was carved that way on purpose, by someone holding a blade, working ivory by hand, probably by firelight. Conard's team published the find in the journal Nature, describing it as one of the oldest known examples of figurative art anywhere in the world, predating the famous cave painting traditions of the same region by thousands of years. Sit with that. 40,000 years ago, whoever made this wasn't stumbling around confused about anatomy. They were rendering it. Precisely. Deliberately. For someone else to see. And that's the part people skip past too fast. Art like this isn't private. You don't spend hours carving something this detailed and then hide it in a drawer. Objects like the Hohle Fels figure were almost certainly handled, shown, passed from hand to hand around a fire, which means anatomical knowledge wasn't some secret ancient people fumbled through alone in the dark. It was depicted, discussed, understood well enough to become art 40,000 years before anyone invented the phrase sex education. Context matters here too. The Hohle Fels cave sits in a region of Germany that's produced an extraordinary concentration of early art, including some of the oldest known musical instruments ever discovered. Carved bone flutes found in the same general area, dated to a similar period. That's relevant because it tells you these weren't isolated survival-focused people with no capacity for anything beyond immediate need. They were people already making music, already making symbolic objects, already clearly capable of abstract representation, taking something real, translating it into carved material, and using it to communicate an idea to someone else. We've fallen a great love for us to build the series that have professors now created some part of it. We've fallen the sense of advancing to make sure that all of the series is true, not just a future commentary, and if there are ways to speak to itself. Anatomical carving wasn't a strange outlier for a mind like that. It was exactly the kind of thing a symbolically sophisticated culture would produce. That's one artifact. It's not remotely alone. Now here's the complication. Because if you assume this was a one-off, some rare isolated weirdo with a knife and too much free time, the actual pattern is going to surprise you. Across Europe, from France to Russia, archaeologists have cataloged dozens of similar so-called Venus figurines. They date from roughly 40,000 years ago to about 11,000 years ago, spanning the entire Upper Paleolithic period, tens of thousands of years, an almost unimaginable stretch of time. The Venus of Willendorf, unearthed in Austria in 1908, now dated to around 25,000 years old, shows the same exaggerated anatomical emphasis. The Venus of Dolní Věstonice, found in what's now the Czech Republic and dated to roughly 26,000 years old, is the oldest known ceramic figure on the entire planet. Fired clay, deliberately shaped, deliberately anatomical, made by someone who understood how to control heat and material well enough to make it permanent. This isn't one artist in one cave with unusual interests. This is a pattern, repeated across a continent, repeated across 29,000 years, made by people who never met, never spoke the same language, and in most cases never even knew the others existed. That's not random. Patterns like that, repeated across cultures, repeated across millennia, almost always point to something being deliberately taught, passed from person to person, generation to generation, kept alive because it mattered enough to keep remaking. So if the obvious answer holds up, the idea that ancient humans just fumbled through this alone, purely on animal instinct, you'd expect the opposite of what we actually find. You'd expect no art like this, no pattern, no consistency across a continent. Instead, you get a tradition spanning almost 30,000 years. That doesn't look like ignorance. It looks a lot more like curriculum. And it's worth actually addressing that instinct argument head on for a second, because it's the single most common assumption people bring into this topic. And it genuinely doesn't survive scrutiny. Yes, sexual attraction itself has instinctive roots. That part's not in dispute, and no researcher argues otherwise. But attraction is not the same thing as knowledge. Attraction doesn't tell you about fertility windows hidden by concealed ovulation. It doesn't tell you which plants might help space out pregnancies. It doesn't tell you how to recognize a birth going wrong, or how to support someone through one. Modern comparisons make this obvious once you think about it directly. Humans are also instinctively driven to eat. Nobody argues that means ancient people didn't need to learn which plants were poisonous, how to track migrating herds, or how to build a fire that wouldn't go out overnight. Instinct provides the drive. It has never in any domain provided the detailed operational knowledge required to survive successfully. That gap always gets filled by learning. This is no exception, but figurines only tell you people were thinking hard about bodies. They don't tell you how knowledge actually moved from one person's head into the next person's head. For that, you need something with a lot less ambiguity. And it turns out ancient people didn't just carve bodies. Some of them drew the act itself. Before we get to those engravings, though, there's a broader anthropological point worth making, because it changes how you should picture the whole social setting this knowledge existed in. Ancient human groups, especially during the Upper Paleolithic, were small. Estimates from archaeological and genetic research suggest many bands numbered somewhere in the range of a few dozen people, occasionally gathering into larger groups of a few hundred for seasonal events or resource-rich periods. In a group that size, privacy in the modern sense barely existed. Shelter was shared. Fires were communal. Daily life happened in close physical proximity, constantly, for everyone. That matters enormously here, because it means knowledge about bodies, reproduction, and sexuality almost certainly wasn't confined to hushed, secretive conversations the way a lot of modern cultures treat it. It was, by necessity, a lived, visible, community-embedded topic, harder to hide, harder to avoid, and therefore harder to leave untaught. The physical conditions of ancient life practically forced this knowledge to circulate. Here's where it gets interesting, because these engravings are more detailed, more specific, and more recent than the figurines. And together, they build a much clearer picture. At La Marche Cave in France, and at a handful of other Upper Paleolithic sites, archaeologists have identified engraved scenes that researchers have interpreted as depicting sexual activity between humans. These are dated to roughly 14 to 12,000 years ago, during what's called the Magdalenian period, the same broad cultural tradition responsible for the famous painted bison and horses at Lascaux. And that detail matters more than it seems. These aren't crude scratches from someone with a spare afternoon and a sharp rock. They're careful, controlled engravings made using the exact same technical skill that produced some of the most celebrated art in human history. In other words, the people making these scenes weren't doodling in the margins. They were using their best tools, their most refined technique, to depict something they clearly considered worth recording with precision. Compare that to how modern culture usually treats depictions like this, either hidden away entirely or treated as shocking, forbidden, something to be embarrassed about. The Magdalenian engravers clearly didn't share that instinct. They used the same careful hand that immortalized a running horse or a charging bison to record something about human bodies and human behavior. That's not shame, that's documentation. The kind of documentation a community makes when it wants information to survive, accurately, past the lifetime of the person who first understood it. Think about what that actually implies. You don't use your finest artistic skill on something trivial. You use it on something that matters to your community. Something worth remembering accurately. Something worth showing to someone else. And it isn't just cave engravings. Portable art tells the same story. Archaeologists have cataloged small carved objects, batons, plaques, figurines, from Magdalenian sites across France and Germany that combine human and animal imagery with anatomical detail too specific to be casual. These weren't fixed to a cave wall where only one group would ever see them. They were portable, small enough to carry, small enough to hand to someone, show them, and hand back. That's a teaching object, not a museum piece, a tool made for one person to physically transfer understanding to another, thousands of years before transfer of understanding needed a fancier name. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. Why carve any of this at all? Why not just, talk about it? The honest answer is, they probably did both. Speech leaves no fossil. Carving does. So every engraved plaque you've just heard about is really evidence of something bigger and quieter happening around it. Conversation, correction, demonstration, all the ordinary mechanics of teaching that never needed a blade to survive. The objects are the visible 5%. The talking was the other 95%, and it's gone. Which is exactly why this topic gets treated like a mystery when it really isn't one. The evidence didn't disappear because it didn't exist. It disappeared because it was never designed to last in the first place. Okay, quick pause here, because this is the part almost nobody explains properly, and it's actually the piece that answers the question in the title. We've established that ancient people weren't confused about anatomy. Fine. But here's the catch. Knowing what things look like isn't the same as knowing what to do with them, when to do it, or what happens if you get the timing wrong. A carving doesn't teach you fertility. It doesn't teach you how to survive childbirth or space out your children so you don't die of exhaustion at 26. So who or what filled that gap? Stay with this next part, because the answer involves cave walls, animal bones, a controversial dot pattern, and a discovery that archaeologists are still arguing about right now, in 2026. Let's talk about tracking, because this is where the story stops being about art and starts being about something closer to science. In the 1970s, archaeologist Alexander Marshack proposed something genuinely radical for its time. He argued that certain engraved bones and antlers from the Upper Paleolithic, objects covered in small, carefully spaced notches, weren't decoration at all. He argued they were records. Specifically, he suggested some of them tracked lunar cycles and possibly menstrual cycles over periods of weeks and months. One of the objects central to this debate is a roughly 25,000-year-old bone plaque from Abri Blanchard in France, marked with a curving sequence of dots that some researchers, building on Marshack's original framework, have proposed represents exactly this kind of cyclical tracking system. Now, here's the honest part, the part a lot of channels skip because it's less satisfying than a clean answer. This idea is contested. It has been for decades. Some researchers support Marshack's interpretation. Others argue the marks are simply decorative or represent something else entirely: a count of days, a hunting tally, a mnemonic device with no connection to fertility at all. It's genuinely not settled science, and anyone who tells you it definitely is a menstrual calendar is overselling the evidence. But here's why the debate itself is still useful to you. Even the skeptics in this argument agree on one thing. These people were capable of, and clearly interested in, tracking cyclical time with real precision. Whether that specific bone plaque was a fertility calendar or a hunting log, the broader behavior, marking, counting, tracking recurring patterns across weeks and months, shows up again and again across sites from this period. That capability is not in dispute. Only the specific application is. And that changes everything about how you should picture this. Because tracking any cycle, fertility or otherwise, isn't something you stumble into by accident. It requires sustained observation across weeks. It requires someone explaining the pattern to someone else, probably an older woman to a younger one, across years, maybe decades of lived experience. That's not instinct. That's teaching. Slow, patient, generational. And it's the kind of teaching that leaves almost no trace in stone, because most of it happened through spoken words that vanished the second they were said. Think about how genuinely hard this problem actually is. Without a calendar, you have no numbered days, no app buzzing a reminder, no little icon marking a fertile window. If you wanted to track a 28-day pattern using nothing but notches on bone, you'd need to already understand that the pattern exists. Remember to mark it consistently, and then teach someone else the entire system from scratch. Verbally, probably more than once, because they wouldn't get it the first time either. That's not a lucky guess. That's applied mathematics running on memory and bone instead of a screen. And it had to be retaught correctly generation after generation, or the whole thread would just snap. There's a broader version of this pattern too, one that goes beyond any single bone plaque. Paleoanthropologists studying Upper Paleolithic sites across Europe have documented a wider habit of mark making, repetitive notches, dots, and lines appearing on bone and antler tools, well beyond the Abri Blanchard example, at sites spanning tens of thousands of years. Not all of these relate to fertility. Some clearly tracked hunting seasons, lunar phases, or other cyclical events entirely unconnected to reproduction. But the underlying skill on display is the same one this video keeps circling back to. These were people who tracked recurring patterns deliberately, recorded them physically, and, this is the part that matters most, passed the method of tracking itself to someone else. You don't inherit a tally system through instinct. You inherit it through instruction. In other words, the reason this whole topic feels mysterious to us isn't because ancient people lacked an education system. It's because their education system was entirely oral, and oral knowledge doesn't fossilize. The carvings and engravings we've actually found are just the tiny visible tip of an enormous invisible iceberg of spoken instruction. Knowledge that existed for 200,000 years and left almost nothing behind for archaeologists to dig up. Now, here's the complication that makes this whole story genuinely strange. Because human sexuality itself is a biological outlier among primates, and the how did they learn it question gets even weirder once you understand exactly what they were trying to learn. Humans are one of the only species on Earth with what biologists call concealed ovulation, meaning there's no obvious external signal, no visible physical change, like the dramatic swelling seen in chimpanzees, announcing exactly when a woman is fertile. Researchers studying the evolution of human reproduction, including work popularized by primatologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, have debated for decades why this trait evolved at all. Some propose it encouraged long-term paternal investment. Others argue it reduced violent competition between males over visibly fertile mates. The theories differ, but here's the practical result, and it's the part that matters for this video. Without an obvious physical signal, ancient humans genuinely could not just wing it. There was no flashing light, no visible cue announcing fertility to the whole camp. Any accurate understanding of fertility timing had to come from patient observation, careful pattern recognition, and knowledge passed down from someone who'd already learned it the hard way. Instinct alone doesn't work when your own body is actively hiding the signal from you. Put that next to a chimpanzee for a second, because the contrast is genuinely striking. A female chimpanzee in estrus develops a visible, unmistakable swelling. No guesswork required, no teaching required. The biology does the communicating on its own. Evolution handed chimpanzees a built-in broadcast system. It didn't hand one to us. Somewhere in the human evolutionary line, that signal disappeared, and it never got replaced with anything equally obvious. Which means every single human generation, going back hundreds of thousands of years, faced a problem chimpanzees never had to solve at all. Figuring out fertility without a built-in signal, using nothing but memory, observation, and whatever the last generation managed to pass down correctly. Sit with that for a second. Nature handed our species one of the hardest reproductive puzzles imaginable to solve without any built-in cheat code. And somehow, generation after generation, people solved it anyway, with nothing but careful watching. And word of mouth and concealed ovulation isn't the only place biology made this harder than it needed to be. Human breast development is another example evolutionary biologists point to. Unlike most primates, human females develop permanent breast tissue at puberty, well before pregnancy, rather than only when nursing begins. Researchers have proposed several competing explanations, signaling fertility, signaling fat reserves sufficient to support a pregnancy, or simply a side effect of other hormonal changes. Again, the theories compete, but the practical effect is the same, one you keep seeing throughout this video. Human bodies changed in ways that made visual, at-a-glance interpretation genuinely difficult. Ambiguous signals don't resolve themselves. They require someone to explain what they mean, which once more points straight back to the same mechanism. Transmitted knowledge, not raw instinct, carrying the species across every one of these biological curveballs. So who was actually doing the teaching? Let's get specific here, because someone taught them is true, but it's also vague, and the real anthropological answer is a lot more interesting than that. Across an enormous number of hunter-gatherer societies documented by anthropologists throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, from groups across sub-Saharan Africa to indigenous communities throughout the Americas, to Aboriginal communities in Australia, researchers have repeatedly documented structured knowledge transmission around puberty, fertility, and sexuality. This teaching was often led by older women. Sometimes it was formalized into specific rites of passage, complete with ceremony and ritual. Sometimes it was informal, woven quietly into daily life, but it kept showing up again and again in cultures that have no contact with each other whatsoever. Stop and consider how unlikely that is, statistically, if this really were just random improvisation. If every ancient culture had genuinely been left to figure reproduction out on its own, with no underlying evolved or cultural logic pushing toward a particular solution, you'd expect wildly different approaches everywhere you looked. Some cultures teaching openly, some not teaching at all. Some assigning the role to fathers, some to peers. some to no one in particular. Instead, anthropologists keep finding roughly the same shape again and again on different continents and societies, with no shared ancestry for tens of thousands of years. Convergence like that, across genuinely independent human populations, is one of the strongest tools anthropology has for identifying something that isn't cultural coincidence. It's a solution so effective, it kept getting rediscovered. Anthropologist Wenda Trevathan, whose research focuses specifically on the evolution of human birth and reproduction, has written extensively about this exact pattern across cultures separated by oceans, by climate. By thousands of years of independent development, older experienced women historically served as the primary source of reproductive knowledge for younger women. Sometimes that role was formal, given a title, wrapped in ceremony. Sometimes it was completely informal, just an aunt, a grandmother, an older friend. But the pattern itself was remarkably consistent, showing up on continents that had zero contact with one another for tens of thousands of years. And in a lot of documented cultures, this teaching wasn't casual at all. It was structured, deliberate, and treated as one of the most important transitions a young person could go through. Ethnographic records from numerous documented societies describe formal female puberty rites, periods of seclusion, instruction, and ceremony often led entirely by older women, specifically built around teaching a younger girl what her body was about to do and how to navigate it. These weren't vague pep talks. In many documented cases, they included direct, explicit instruction about menstruation, fertility, and sexual conduct, delivered by women the community trusted specifically because they'd already survived the process themselves. That detail is the whole point. The teacher wasn't a stranger with a textbook. The teacher was someone who'd lived it, who had every incentive to get it right, because the girl in front of her might be her own daughter, her niece, her granddaughter. That's a genuinely elegant system when you think about it. No printing press, no centralized curriculum. Just lived experience, handed downward, filtered through people who had the strongest possible motivation to make sure the next generation didn't repeat their mistakes. Worth being clear here, too, this wasn't purely a female-only system, sealed off from the rest of the community. Ethnographic records also document parallel male initiation practices in numerous documented societies, sometimes involving older men teaching younger men about their own role in courtship, sexuality, and eventually, fatherhood. The specific content differed, the underlying mechanism didn't. Older, experienced members of the community, teaching younger ones, using structured ritual to make sure the knowledge landed and stuck. Two parallel tracks, often kept somewhat separate but running on the exact same logic. Experience gets converted into instruction, deliberately, because the alternative is too costly. It's less documented and less studied than the female-focused rites. Partly because much of the anthropological fieldwork this reconstruction draws from happened to focus more heavily on female puberty rites specifically. But the broader pattern of elder-led, structured teaching around reproduction shows up on the male side too, often enough that it's clearly not an isolated exception. That consistency is the whole ballgame here. When completely unconnected cultures, separated by oceans and by millennia, independently arrive at the exact same solution, older women teaching younger women, that's not a coincidence. That's usually a sign you're looking at something deeply functional, something that kept getting reinvented over and over in isolation, specifically because it kept working. So here's the part that should actually stop you for a second. We know childbirth killed a huge share of women throughout most of human history. We know the body hides its own fertility signal. We know figurines, engravings, and tracking tools all point toward deliberate teaching. So why does this whole topic still feel like a mystery to you? Why click on a video asking who taught ancient humans this instead of already knowing the answer? Here's the uncomfortable part. It's not because the knowledge didn't exist. It's because somewhere along the way, we stopped treating it as knowledge worth passing down loudly and started treating it as something to whisper about, avoid, or squeeze into a 15-minute health class unit nobody remembers. Ancient people didn't have that luxury. They couldn't afford to. Keep that in mind for what's coming next, because it gets even more specific. There's actually a deeper evolutionary reason older women specifically ended up in this role. And it's one of the more compelling ideas in the whole field. It's called the grandmother hypothesis, proposed and developed by researchers including anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, based on long-term fieldwork with the Hadza people of Tanzania. The hypothesis argues that human females evolved menopause, living decades past the point of being able to have children themselves, specifically because older, post-reproductive women provided enormous value to their communities in other ways. Not through childbearing, through knowledge, labor, and support. Hawkes and her collaborators observed that Hadza grandmothers spent significant time helping gather food for grandchildren, freeing up younger mothers to have more children sooner and improving those children's survival odds. It's a genuinely elegant explanation for a trait, menopause, that's otherwise strange from a pure evolutionary standpoint, since most animals remain fertile until close to death. Now stretch that idea slightly, because the implications reach further than food. If older women were evolutionarily positioned as the community's stockpile of accumulated experience, the ones who'd already survived pregnancy, already survived childbirth, already raised children to adulthood, they weren't just useful for gathering food. They were, structurally, the most qualified teachers a community could possibly have on exactly the topic this video is about. Nature didn't just allow older women to become the reproductive educators of ancient human society. Multiple respected researchers now argue nature may have actively selected for it, keeping women alive and healthy for decades, specifically so that role could exist. It's still debated. Like most evolutionary hypotheses about behavior this far back, it's not universally accepted, and other researchers have proposed complementary or competing explanations for menopause. But it lines up strikingly well with everything else in this video: the figurines, the engravings, the tracking devices, all pointing toward the same conclusion from a completely different angle. This knowledge had a designated keeper, and evolution itself may have helped build the role. This is where the myth really falls apart. The image of ancient humans just figuring it out, in the moment, alone, through blind trial and error, does not survive contact with the actual evidence. What really happened looks a lot more like an informal but genuine curriculum. Observation, mentorship, oral tradition, art used as a teaching aid, passed down specifically because the cost of getting it wrong was catastrophic. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, and it might be the strangest one of all, because this system also had to transmit knowledge about preventing pregnancy. Not just achieving it, turns out evidence for ancient birth control is real, even if it's incomplete, and in places genuinely ambiguous. Historical and ethnobotanical research has documented that numerous traditional societies used plant-based substances believed to have contraceptive or abortifacient properties. Silphium is probably the most famous example, a plant used across the ancient Mediterranean, referenced repeatedly by Roman-era writers, including Pliny the Elder, and prized highly enough that it appeared on ancient coinage from the city of Cyrene before it was remarkably harvested into extinction. Beyond silphium, ethnobotanists have documented a wide range of herbal preparations used across African, Asian, and indigenous American pharmacological traditions, all aimed at the same basic goal: controlling fertility, deliberately using plant knowledge passed down through generations. Think about how strange that silphium story actually is, once you slow down and look at it directly. A plant, valued specifically for its reproductive effects, became so central to an economy that an entire city put its image on official currency. That's not a minor folk remedy quietly used by a handful of people. That's a plant with a documented, named, economically significant role in reproductive control. Important enough to shape trade, important enough to shape coinage design, important enough that Roman writers bothered recording it centuries after its peak use. And then it vanished completely, over-harvested into extinction, sometime around the 1st century. A plant so specific to one region's growing conditions that nobody could successfully cultivate it anywhere else. It's one of history's stranger footnotes. A contraceptive plant so effective, or at least so believed to be effective, that an entire civilization used it into oblivion. Now, the reliability of these methods varied enormously, and some almost certainly didn't work the way people believed they did. This is another place where honest uncertainty matters more than a clean, satisfying answer. We can't verify precise effectiveness rates for most of these ancient remedies, but the existence of a widespread cross-cultural sustained effort to control fertility using specific, named, repeatedly used plants tracked and refined over generations tell you something crucial. This wasn't blind guesswork. Someone identified which plants seemed to work. Someone tested them, informally, across dozens or hundreds of generations. Someone refined the knowledge and passed it down the chain. That's applied science, functioning centuries, maybe millennia, before the scientific method ever got a name. Think about the actual logistics of that for a second, because it's easy to skim past. Somebody in a community, generations before anyone else, tries a plant, notices a pattern. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, and the observation gets refined instead of thrown out. That knowledge then has to survive being spoken correctly, remembered accurately, and repeated to the right person at the right moment in her life. Over and over, for centuries, without a single written record backing it up. One broken link in that chain, one generation that didn't pass it on clearly, and the knowledge is just gone, permanently. The fact that so much of it survived long enough to be documented by anthropologists and historians centuries later tells you the transmission system behind it was genuinely robust. Fragile sounding, sure. Oral tradition always sounds fragile from the outside, but functionally, it held up for thousands of years, which is longer than most modern institutions have even existed. And it's worth being honest about the limits of a purely oral system too, because that's part of the story. Knowledge like this wasn't uniform. It almost certainly varied from group to group, region to region, shaped by local plants, local climate, local trial and error. Some of it was probably wrong, or only worked in specific circumstances, and there's no way to fully reconstruct which version of which method was accurate in which place. That's not a flaw in this explanation. That's just what happened when your entire medical and reproductive knowledge base has to live inside human memory instead of a shared, checkable text. It's remarkable it worked at all, and even more remarkable how consistently it did. And that's really the mechanism this entire video has been circling. Anthropologists have a specific name for the broader version of this idea: cumulative cultural transmission. It's the concept that humans, unlike almost any other species, don't just individually learn things and let that knowledge die with them. We stack it. Each generation inherits what the last one figured out, adds to it, refines it, and passes the improved version forward. Researchers studying human cognitive evolution, including work associated with evolutionary psychologist Joseph Henrich, have argued that this stacking process, sometimes called the cultural ratchet, is one of the core traits that separates human learning from that of every other species on Earth, including our closest primate relatives. Chimpanzees can learn to crack nuts with a stone, but that specific technique rarely improves meaningfully across chimpanzee generations, the way human technique does across ours, generation after generation, endlessly refined. Apply that idea to everything in this video, and the whole picture finally clicks into focus. Not one teacher, not one book, a layered ratcheting system built out of sheer necessity. Observation of the body first. Art used to depict and normalize anatomy. Second, informal mentorship heavily concentrated in older women. Third, oral tradition carrying fertility knowledge across generations. Fourth, trial and error botanical knowledge refined over centuries, passed down through the exact same oral pathways. Fifth, each piece inherited, tested against real outcomes, corrected and improved before being handed to the next generation. That's the actual mechanism, not instinct, not luck. Cumulative culture, the same trait that eventually gave us agriculture, medicine, and everything else, just applied here first, to the single most urgent survival problem a species can have. Strip away the mystery framing, and what you're left with is something almost mundane in hindsight. Ancient humans did what humans always do with high-stakes, complicated knowledge. They built an informal education system, and they ran it, person to person, for 200,000 years. Because the alternative was people dying from information they simply didn't have. Here's the honest caveat, though, because a good version of this story doesn't oversell what we actually know for certain. A huge amount of this reconstruction comes from indirect evidence, figurines, engravings, ambiguous bone markings, and careful comparisons to more recent hunter-gatherer societies that may or may not perfectly reflect what happened deep in prehistory. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. We don't have a transcript of a Paleolithic mother explaining fertility cycles to her daughter beside a fire, because spoken words from 40,000 years ago simply don't survive. What we do have is a consistent pattern of physical evidence pointing toward deliberate transmission, and a consistent pattern in living and historically documented cultures doing something remarkably similar, independently, again and again. That's not proof in a courtroom sense, but it's about as strong as prehistoric behavioral evidence ever realistically gets. It's also worth saying plainly, using recent hunter-gatherer societies to reconstruct deep prehistory is a genuinely debated method in anthropology, and it has real limits. Living communities studied by 20th century researchers aren't frozen time capsules of the Paleolithic. They've had their own history, their own changes, their own adaptations over tens of thousands of years, just like everyone else on the planet. Using them as a rough analogy for how ancient teaching might have worked is a reasonable, widely used method. But it's an analogy, not a direct window into the past. Good researchers flag that distinction constantly, and a good explanation of this topic should too, instead of treating every parallel as a perfect one-to-one match. The honest version of this story is a little messier than the clean version. It's still a strong case. It's just not an airtight one, and it shouldn't be presented as though it were. So, quick gut check for you in the comments. If you had to guess, who do you think did most of the actual teaching back then? Older women? The whole community? Together? All at once? Drop your guess below, because the anthropological evidence leans pretty hard in one specific direction. And it might not be the one you'd expect. Which brings this whole thing back to right now. Back to you. You live in a world with search engines, apps, and let's be honest, a genuinely overwhelming amount of contradictory advice about bodies and relationships. Some of it accurate, a lot of it absolute nonsense, dressed up to look like fact, spreading faster than anyone can correct it. It's easy to assume that mess is a uniquely modern problem, something only a hyper-connected, over-informed 2026 brain could ever face. It isn't. Ancient humans dealt with a version of the exact same core issue you do right now. How do you get accurate, high-stakes information about your own body from someone who actually knows what they're talking about, instead of guessing and hoping you got lucky? The tools were different. The underlying problem wasn't. They just solved it their way, with carved ivory shaped by firelight passed hand to hand around a circle of people who trusted each other, with cycles tracked in notches on bone, painstakingly kept, painstakingly retaught, with engraved scenes on cave walls made using the same steady hands that painted the animals now famous around the world, with plants tested over centuries, refined generation after generation, until the knowledge was reliable enough to matter. And underneath all of it, holding the whole system together, an older woman sitting down beside a younger one at exactly the right moment in her life, and simply telling her the truth. That's not a lesser version of sex education. In a lot of ways, it's a more honest one. No algorithm pushing exaggeration for clicks. No anonymous forum full of confident nonsense. Just someone who'd survived the exact thing you were about to face, choosing to make sure you didn't have to face it blind. Picture that torch-lit cave wall one more time. That careful carving, 40,000 years old, made by hand, made on purpose, meant to be seen. That bone plaque notched patiently across weeks, tracking a body's rhythm long before anyone had a word for biology. That older woman teaching, generation after generation, so the next one wouldn't have to guess alone. Nobody figured this out alone.